This is the third and final message in our current series, in which we have been looking at the various issues of how we can have a more deeper Christian life. We began by looking at the idea that we need to know more about the presence of God in us. It's that inner presence that gives us all the strength we need. Last week we talked about finding that inner peace that enables us to face all the storms of life and to deal with all the temptations and anxiety and desire we have to control life. But today we're going to take a look at the subject of trusting God, or what we might call faith. And we might think in terms of looking at faith from this perspective of how we can have a deeper faith. The key word is deeper. I'm sure everyone here today has some kind of a faith that you depend upon. And it's what gets you through the night, and it works for you at this time. But I think we all can understand that this is a situation in which we can do better, and we can have a deeper, more meaningful faith that will enable us to face these complex and difficult times we have to face. And so that's what I would like to take a look at today. I feel like Christians today are very much like this man in the Gospel of Mark, who comes to the disciples with his child who is epileptic, and they can't do anything to heal him. They try, but there's nothing they can do. And Jesus finds out that they're upset about that, and he goes and asks about what the problem was. And the man cries out to Jesus and says, "Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief." I think that's the state of mind that many of us have. We believe, but help our state of unbelief. You know, in the famous movie Forrest Gump, one of the expressions that came out of that movie is that life is like a box of chocolates. Well, I have a saying about faith. Faith is like an ice cream sundae with a brownie on the bottom. And the reason I say it that way, and I don't know if you've ever experienced one of those kind of great ice cream sundaes where there's all this white foamy stuff on top and all these little fruits in there, and then they got all the ice cream in there, and then at the very bottom is the most delicious brownie you ever tasted. But to get to the brownie, you got to do some digging, you see. Otherwise, you're just eating the fluffy top, you see. And so I think faith is that way. We got to keep working at digging down deeper to where our faith really begins to be exciting and taste so good, because it is what equips us to face the lives we have to face. So today's message is really more about the idea of digging more deeply into our faith to discover those thoughts and ideas that can help us find the brownie, as I would say, to find the good stuff, to where we can endure all the things that come our way, all the difficulties we face. So, as I was reading the scriptures and studying this week, I isolated 3 basic truths that I think we find. And if we can understand these truths, it will help us to see what we need to do to dig a little more deeply into our faith life and find a little bit more of the real deep faith that we need. The first one of these comes from the ideas that was presented to us in the book of Exodus this morning, which we heard, in which God makes a promise. And God is really big on making promises. All throughout the Bible, throughout the Scriptures, we see that word promise over and over and over. God promises this or promises that. God is a God of promise. I may not can give this to you right now, but I promise I will give it to you as it is time to give it to you. You see, this is the kind of God we have. Our relationship with Him starts with a promise. A promise of what He can do to deliver us up out of our misery. We have to learn how to stand on that promise. Keep that promise in our head and never forget that promise. Because sometimes, many times, His promises take many years to come about. It's not an instant gratification like we have here in our current day, in which we want something and we get it right away. No. The way God operates is over time. But He always operates on the basis of what He has promised to give us. So it's important for us to remember that this is how we live in this world. We live on the promise, not on the reality. Because the reality has not yet occurred. We live by the promise. I had an experience when I was a young seminarian. One of the things that we were required to do as part of our education, each summer we had to go to some place and do mission work. And one of the years I went to the Navajo mission near Tuba, Arizona, and spent 3, almost 4 months there with the Navajo people, working with them and doing what I could to try to help their young people especially understand a little thing or two about who God was and how God could help them. And you know, I had lived in the United States for many, many years, of course, at that point, and I did not know how grim the lives of those indigenous people who the United States put on reservations was. A very grim life. Yeah, they gave them a bunch of land, but it was desert. And what can you grow on a desert? And very little water. They had to dig these deep wells just to have a little water. So they were a people, the Navajo people, were a people that were very discouraged and filled with despair because they didn't think they had much of a future. And you would have to kind of agree with them when you saw the mud huts they lived in and their children not even able to go to the English-speaking U.S. schools. Not much hope at all. But anyway, we came up with a project, myself and some of the elders of the tribes, and we called it New Seeds. New Seeds. And we decided to take all the children that were between 4, 5, and 6 years old, and we were going to create for them a special educational program that would bring in qualified teachers, qualified volunteers, people who would help them to learn reading and writing and arithmetic and to learn how to speak English. And we called it New Seeds because we believed that that program would one day bear fruit. It was kind of like God's promise to us. And it was a promise in which God had said to us, I will raise up a new generation for you. And so we did the work, and it was a lot of work to it, and we called upon a lot of volunteers. We had a lot of other young people in my age group at the time came in, and we did all we could to help these young people begin to grow mentally and to grow spiritually. And of course I was only there for 3 months or 4, and I left after that, but the program continued. The elders made sure they did that. The next volunteers that came made sure they did that. And 24 years later, the first of those students graduated from medical school. And then after that, we had someone graduate from law school. And then we had someone graduate from other colleges. And the next thing you know, all the Navajo children that were made part of that program of the New Seeds became the new generation for that tribe there near Tuba, Arizona. And they didn't just abandon their people. They came back and they took their funds that they earned now because they had an education and they could do things in the world. And they made that place into a much more wonderful and hope-filled place than it had ever been before. But the reason I tell that story of the new seeds is because that was in my life the first time I had ever stood on the promises of God. You know, it was in my heart and my mind that if we did that, and if we believed in that, and if we worked toward it, God would bring it to be. It took 20 years, 24 years or so for it to really show fruition. But that's not the point. The point is none of that's going to happen unless we believe the promise in the beginning. You got to hear the promise, believe the promise, and then do the work the promise requires. That's what you got to do. And never look back. Never say, oh, goodness, it's been 6 years and nothing good's ever happened. No, that is not the right way to think about it. If God promises it, it will be done. I can tell you that. I guarantee you that. So that's kind of the first thought that we need to remember in our own lives. That God has promised to raise us up out of our misery. Maybe you don't have any misery in your life right now. I hope not. But many of us do have miseries in our life. And those miseries do weigh us down. And they do cause us a lot of difficulty, a lot of loss of sleep. But here's what God has promised. You will be delivered from your misery. That means then you got to believe that first before anything else goes down. Before you do anything, say anything, try anything, you got to believe the promise first. Hear it and believe it and never look back. That'll get you down to the brownie, you see. That's where the brownie really is. It's in that kind of faith. Because that's what will get you through those times when you are filled with misery. And when you do have to face a lot of difficulty. And when it may take quite a while for that to take place. And all of that makes you feel sad and despair-filled. But if you go back and remember that you have been promised that you will be delivered from your misery. If you remember that, believe that, stand on it. Those new seeds will grow something that is unbelievable. And something you could never have imagined would have happened. So that's the first thought I have. You need to hear the promise and stand on it. It's like the old hymn, standing on the promises. That's what we are doing here. Because we have not yet seen the final results of what God is doing in our lives. We have not seen what God is going to do to get us through all the days ahead. We've not seen any of that. But we have been promised that we will get through it and that victory will be ours. Stand on the promise. The second one comes to us from the reading we had in Hebrews. The inspiration there was that we must proclaim that our faith does not depend on what we see. It depends on the promise that God has made. But the point there is that we need to proclaim that. We need to say it to ourselves. God has promised me whatever. We need to say it to others. God has promised me. We need to say it over and over and over again. Because when we proclaim it, when we say that our faith is the confidence of what we hope for and the assurance of that which we have not yet seen. When we say that, when we actually verbalize it, it changes you. It changes what goes on inside of you. It's like all of a sudden you've heard a prophecy. And that prophecy is now what motivates you and fulfills you with the power you need to do what you need to do. So, the second thought we have then is this necessity to actually verbalize the fact that you believe God has promised redemption for you in whatever way it is that you might need redemption. God has promised it. And you need to proclaim that, not only to yourself, but to the whole world, if possible. I didn't believe that for a long time, and now I do, 100% now. I have no doubt that that's one of the most important things to do. Because something about saying it out loud, something about saying it to yourself and saying it to others, gives you that confidence, gives you that assurance that you need to get through the day. When I was a teenager growing up in the First Methodist Church of Irving, Texas, when I was growing up in that church, I was in the youth group, of course, and from time to time, they would ask one of us, older ones as I was at that time, to read a scripture in the worship service, the evening worship service, of course. And I would do that occasionally. And we had an elderly lady there that, as teenagers, we kind of made fun of her because we kind of thought she was crazy. Her name was Lucy, and we called her Old Lucy Lucy. I don't know how old she was, but she was pretty old. She had a cane, but she always liked to hang around us young people. We couldn't quite understand why she was always coming over to tell us something and to talk to us. But she always had something kind of strange to say. And one night after I read the scriptures, she came over to me in the back of the sanctuary where we were having snacks. And she said, "I've seen a vision." And I thought, oh my goodness. Here's old Lucy Doocy got a vision. She says, "I see you someday in a black robe preaching the gospel." And I laughed to myself, boy, you really did have a vision, didn't you? Because in those days, I was a rock musician, and I was going to be one of the next Beatles of the world. That didn't quite work out. She had a vision, and she told me about that. And I didn't think much of it until life went on, and I ended up finding myself in seminary, which I had never planned to do that. Finding myself studying the gospel all of a sudden. And then there I could remember old Lucy Doocy saying to me, "I have a vision. I see you preaching the gospel in a black robe." And you know that actually did happen, because in the Methodist church in those days we wore the black robes and the stoles and all that. And there I was preaching the gospel in a black robe. I wonder what old Lucy Doocy would think about my shirts. She didn't mention that, but anyway. The point is, I got strength from remembering her proclamation, because I tell you the truth, my trip into the ministry was a difficult one. It was a hard one, and many times I doubted that I was meant to be a pastor, that I was meant to preach the gospel. But every now and then I would remember that proclamation, "I see you in a black robe preaching the gospel." I'm just trying to say to you that another great way of digging on down to get to the brownie, to get your faith lifted up, is don't just sit there and say, "Well, yeah, God's promised me, and I know, I read it here." No, proclaim it. Say it out loud. Say it to anybody that will listen to you. "I believe God is going to deliver me from this misery in which I find myself." You don't have to spell all the details out, but you do have to proclaim that you believe that God is working on delivering you from the miseries that you are in. You see, that's the purpose of God in our life. That's why God works in our lives and does things in our life, and there's no accidents and there's no chaos. The reason is God is working on delivering us from whatever misery we find ourselves in. And so you need to think about the fact that that's what God has promised to do. And you need to proclaim it to yourself, proclaim it to others, and you will begin to feel that confidence. And you'll begin to feel that assurance. If God said it, who am I to doubt it? You see, it really empowers you. And then the final thing I had to share with you today is a story that I know I've told here before, but I think it was about 6 years ago, and I don't think too many of you were here 6 years ago. Some were. Yes, we do have some of the good ones who've been with us all the time. But it's a story about a young woman that was in the youth group I was leading many years ago. She was a wonderful young woman, a young lady about 18 years old. She did so much for our youth group. She had a beautiful voice. She sang. It was great. And of course, the tragedy that happened in her life, she was out one night with some friends, and they were just coming home from eating. And the next thing that they know, they got run into by a drunk driver in a pickup, and it killed 2 of the young girls. And she was put into a coma, deep coma. And of course, we had prayed for her, and we had a relationship in which we wished and prayed that she would wake up from her coma. Myself, all the other pastors in the church, we all went there. Many of the brothers and sisters of the community went there and prayed with her in her coma state. But her mother was always by her side. Her mother sat there in that hospital room and prayed and prayed and prayed. And the days went by, and the months went by, and she got thinner and thinner, of course. And by that time, the doctors had decided there was no brain activity. They told us that so many times, I was sick of hearing it. No brain activity. And of course, the suggestion was that we should, as they used to say in those days, pull the plug. Let her go on. And the mother would not hear of it. Because the mother had received a promise in her mind from God. And the promise she had received from God was that her daughter would live again. And that was the promise she had received, and she was so certain of it. She believed it in such a stubborn way. None of us could convince her. None of us could persuade her in any way to go ahead and pull the plug. It's been 6 months. 7 months went on. 8 months went on. And it was just obvious to every one of us that that was what needed to be done. Well, I had developed a routine over that time period, going there every Thursday to visit and to pray. And it was in the 9th month that I went there to go and pray and visit with the mother, try to give some comfort if I could. And I had finished my prayers and was ready to say goodbye, and I was just getting ready to walk out the door when I heard this voice, "Mama." That young girl woke up that day. She woke up from a 9-month coma. And as far as I know, she's still alive to this day. But the thing about it was how stubbornly the mother believed in the promise. You see? That's the key to really digging into your faith and finding that you have the resolve to believe the promise you've been given, to believe the hope that you've been shown, to just hold on to it and hold on to it and hold on to it and reject any doubt, reject anyone saying anything other than what you believe to be the case, that God will bring to you the victory that God intends to bring to you. And so I would leave that thought with you today. There's many times when we have received a promise from God that seems so impossible. Seems like it's so something that just could not happen. The Bible tries to explain that with the story of Sarah, Abram's wife, and how she was told when she was 99 years old, "You're going to have a baby." How impossible is that? But that was the promise of God. And when that baby was born, God says, "You must name that baby Isaac." And you know what that means in Hebrew? It means the joke's on you. You see, this is the whole thing about it. Our faith is based upon the one who gives us his promises and intends to bring us his deliverance. But in human reality, we base our faith on what we can see, what we can touch, what we can prove. How limited is that? How powerless is that? How hopeless is that? But the gospel gives us the possibility. The gospel gives us the good news that we can learn and discipline ourselves to become those who walk by faith and not by sight. And so then, to sum it up, we need to hear the promise, number one, and stand on it. And then we need to proclaim that promise to ourselves and to anyone who will listen to us anyway. And then finally, we need to stubbornly believe what we have been promised and reject anything else that might try to change our minds. Then we will truly know the blessing that Jesus was speaking of when he said, "Blessed are those who have believed and not yet seen." Amen. Let's receive our benediction now. And now may you go forth into this world of doubt and darkness and know that God has loved you and will continue to love you, and that your faith is based upon His promise of that, now and forever. Amen.